this computer.
Ever had a webinar in semester 2 or in
yeah, we're kind of learning as we
2020?
go. Or it could just be that in terms of social psychology, they know what's going on and they, you know. My other fear though is that since you only finished lecturing last Thursday, to have a revision webinar less than a week after, maybe they haven't got onto it yet.
Fair enough.
But I think this is preferable than having one in the middle of the exam period when they definitely won't want to attend that. So we'll see how we go. We've got 12 people watching already. And I am recording this now. So basic format is they're firing off questions on Mentimeter. I'll share my screen. Shaun will read out the question and then you can take a shot trying to answer it.
Sure.
The first one looks scarily specific.
What was the purpose of Sanjay Srivasta's paper? Was he supporting Simmons' 2011 paper or was he against it? Sorry, I'm a bit confused. Could you give a bit of context first, Rebecca, if this is relevant? So what's Sanjay's paper?
This is actually, it's from the first lecture when I was discussing the replication crisis and I was talking about how there was a lot of hand-wringing going on. And I showed a fake syllabus from Sanjay Srivastava's fake class called Everything is F'd, the syllabus. And it went through how everything that we know with respect to methods, with respect to various types of methods, with respect to statistical tests, there's been a lot of hand-wringing and introspection. So it's not something, it wasn't something serious. It was mostly just to show that this replication crisis has let us all have a bit of introspection regarding everything that we do in all of our training. And then hopefully I was able to tell students that that isn't in fact the case, that we're all just wringing our hands in despair. And in fact, there's been a lot of positive change regarding replication and regarding research methods and training. And there's now the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. So things are getting better. Ultimately, Sanjay's syllabus was just for fun, but the Simmons 2011 paper was a way of trying to understand the various questionable research practices that researchers have and how it is that we can learn to do better.
Okay.
Great.
I don't think Shaun and I would have known what that question was about.
No doubt. Again, there are only 7 questions. So guys, if you go to 887634 on menti.com, you can post more questions or else Rebecca's going to leave halfway through. So use the opportunity. Will websites such as psychfiledrawer.org, etc. be assessed? How would you assess psych?
No. That's a great point, Shaun, and it comes from the same lecture. That was just me trying to explain that there are ways that we are now doing things. That part wasn't really accessible content. I just wanted to provide context. Being the token social psychology instructor in this unit of study, it's important for me to address head on that there has been this replication crisis and that social psychology has been at the forefront, basically under the spotlight, and also at the forefront of making changes in that regard. And psychfiledrawer.org was one website that I mentioned as a place that people can now prevent their studies from being, swept under the rug and that they'll never see the light of day. Instead, you can place them on these kinds of repositories so that other researchers don't end up spinning their wheels trying to chase the reliability or robustness of a particular phenomenon without understanding that, look, all of these other labs have also tried to find that phenomenon and they have been unable to do so. So a place like psychfiledrawer.org is a public repository where researchers can publish their null results without it being in a traditional journal format.
So trying to get around the publication bias of only, okay, cool.
Precisely.
I think that's, so is that 6 from 6 now, Caleb, about misinterpreting examples and scenarios for exam questions? I think every single lecturer has said that way. You're not going to ask questions on the specific examples provided in the lectures.
I guess so. The thing that worries me about a question like this is if you twist it around, maybe the student's asking, can I ignore it completely? No, it's enough, surely, Rebecca, to know what it is and what its purpose is.
Right, and the context, which was this is something we're doing to try to, as Shaun said, avoid or minimize publication bias.
Yep. Okay.
I'm glad you're tackling this topic, Rebecca. It's very good. It's a great way to start. Still a bit confused about the difference between the theory of reason action and the theory of planned behavior. So maybe go into what they both are. I've got no idea.
So one of them expands upon the other, and it's basically, I'm just going to pull up the slides and maybe I can share those.
Yep. Just be careful. The other week, Shaun shared his page of emails.
Okay, I think I shut
Only for half a second, but we caught it.
Okay, I think I've closed my email, so that's unlikely to happen.
Good start, yeah.
Let me just see how to do this.
Is it lecture overheads, Rebecca? Because I can show them if you want. If you tell me which lecture, I can dig them up.
Oh, that's okay. I've got it. I just need to find this one. So here we are. You can see this, right?
Yep.
So the theory of reasoned action, well, I've got my examples of my animations here, but it's got these two factors that lead towards behavior: attitudes towards a person's behavior and subjective norms. And these two factors influence behavioral intentions, which in turn influence behavior. And so I went through how the theory of reasoned action really helped to resolve another crisis in social psychology, which was that researchers were finding that, lo and behold, they had all these measures of attitudes, but they were not very good at predicting behavior. And so what's the point in measuring attitudes if they don't serve any function, if they don't serve any predictive function? And Fishbein and Eisen came along with the theory of reasoned action to say, one of the problems is that we're measuring things at different levels. We're measuring very general attitudes and very specific behaviors. And if you want to have any attempt at making sure that your attitudes have some sort of predictive function, then you need to have a specificity matched between what it is that people are assessing with the attitude and what behavior they're measuring. So this example here was set up with respect to, I think it was attitudes towards contraception. And I'd said, you can't ask about general attitudes towards contraception and then measure a very specific behavior like using the oral contraceptive. You have to ask, what is your attitude towards oral contraceptive? And then you can use that to feed into this theory of reasoned action trajectory here, where we've got a behavioral intention, whether people are planning to use oral contraceptives, and then whether they actually do. The subjective norms part is what other people who are important to you think about the particular behavior or what their attitudes are. So those two things together, what my attitude is and what my subjective norms coming from people who I care about, what I think they think of this behavior, those two factors influence my intention, in this case, to use oral contraceptives and ultimately to do so. That was the theory of reasoned action. And that did improve prediction, but then they came along a little bit later, a few years later, with the theory of planned behavior, which looks the same, but adds perceived behavioral control. So if it's easy, if I think that I can actually perform a particular behavior, if it's easy, that feeds into my intention to actually do the behavior. But there's also, they found a direct path between how easy and how difficult it is. There's a direct link there between how that perceived behavioral control and actually carrying out the behavior. So I talked about whether it's easy to do. The flip side of that is, if the perceived behavioral control is that this is a difficult task, then that's going to mean that it's less likely that I'll form a strong behavioral intention and then the opportunity to perform the behavior. So all three of those things are working together in the theory of planned behavior. The theory of reasoned action, which was the precursor, was just the first two factors: attitudes towards behavior and subjective norms influencing behavioral intention.
I don't think we do that in cognitive psychology. I think we would have called it theory of reasoned action Mark II. It's really just adding a box, as far as from what I can see.
Yes, you're right. You're right. And this way they get more citations and stuff.
So Rebecca, in both of those models, you have like intention leading to behavior. So I'm assuming that those aren't the same thing then. So intention can sometimes not lead to behavior. Precisely.
So intention is a proxy for behavior. There are other things in the causal chain which may disrupt it. So it's not always the case that just because you have, the best intention to do something, that you'll actually ultimately perform the behavior.
You didn't need to ask for questions, Shaun. Now we got 15.
It's a good thing. Is the IAT test just a way of measuring people's unconscious association between concepts? And is that how it relates to implicit attitudes?
Yes, the IAT test is just a way of measuring people's unconscious association between concepts. That's how it's set up. Meant to tap into attitudes that people are either unwilling to express publicly or unable to express publicly. By being unable, that's trying to capture this unconscious idea. People may not even realize that two concepts are linked together. And so the IAT, being a reaction time measure, is meant to tap into that. And that whole concept of something happening under the surface that people may not have conscious awareness of, that is meant to be, that's set up as an implicit attitude, which is really in contrast to the explicit attitudes where we're able to fill out a measure on a survey that expresses that, yes, I'm in strong agreement with political party X, or I strongly favor cola brand Y, or whatever the case, whatever the attitude object is that people are studying.
And have the students been given, oh, well, they don't need to be given anything. Have they been told you can just Google IAT test and you can do them on yourself on the internet?
That's right. And I put the link up as well to Project Implicit. What's interesting about the IAT is how it took off in terms of popularity. And there are, on that Project Implicit website, there are IATs for everything. I mentioned cola preferences. That's legitimately an IAT you can take, whether you prefer Pepsi versus Coke, whether you prefer K-pop or, R&B. There's an IAT for everything. And then there's a whole controversy surrounding, does it actually measure what we think it measures? Are these things the same as an explicit attitude? And the authors themselves would be the first to say, no, they're not the same. They're not identical. They're trying to tap into something slightly different. But there's a lot of controversy about this, which I think I hinted at in the lectures, but I leave it to my colleagues in second and third year social psych to go into more of the controversies surrounding what the IAT is. I just wanted to introduce it as one way that researchers have measured the broad umbrella topic of attitudes without, something separate from the explicit attitude.
Yeah, separate from self-report.
Correct.
And just because you have an unconscious association between K-pop doesn't mean that you're not going to stop listening to R&B. It doesn't translate directly into behavior. I think that's what the person who asked this question knew the answer, I think, because they've asked it in such a good way. The answer is basically yes. And yes, it's just the unconscious association, and that does not necessarily drive behavior directly. It may be that you've been exposed to a lot of media associating the two concepts, but ultimately you would not behave in that way.
Is Rebecca in Canada? I'm assuming it's the backdrop as well as just your physical location.
I am not in Canada. The backdrop has consistently been in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. I'm specifically in the small town of Twin Peaks because it just seemed fitting and appropriate for the bizarre times we find ourselves in.
Okay. We can't complain about the weather today to Rebecca though, because it might be chilly for Sydney, but compared to Canada, this is a mild autumn day.
Indeed.
Yep. Could you explain the actor-observer bias again with an example? Thank you.
So the actor-observer bias is about attributions for behavior. And when we are the actor, and I don't mean, an actor like on the stage, but the person performing the action, the actor, we are predisposed to be looking out at the world. That's what's salient to us, is what is outside of us. So when we're involved in performing a behavior, in action, what's salient to us is what's around. And so we take the situation or the environment or the context into account as a cause for our behavior. We make attributions that are external. On the other hand, people who are witnessing the actor, people who are observing someone perform an action, what's most salient to them is that person and what they're doing. And that leads to an observer making internal attributions. They're focused on the person performing the behavior. They are situating the cause or attribution for that person's behavior within the person. So it's mostly just a way of identifying that there is a discrepancy in how we make attributions for behaviors based on perspectives. And the perspective of the actor is looking out. The perspective of the observer is kind of focusing in on the actor. So discrepancy in that actors make external attributions for behavior and observers make internal attributions to the actor for what's happening.
Is this adjacently related to like the fundamental attribution error, or is that separate?
It is related to the fundamental attribution error. It's essentially, for most of us, when we're engaging in the fundamental attribution error, it's because we're observers.
No.
And so as observers, we're placing the causal agent is the person. The person is we're making an internal or dispositional attribution for whatever it is that we're seeing, and we're not focusing on the situation. But when you're actually the person performing, you're able to take the situation into account. Unless, of course, you go through some kind of perspective taking exercise, in which case you can flip those two perspectives around and watch actors' attributions become more internal and observers' attributions will become more situational when you ask people to take the psychological perspective of the other party.
So say, for example, I'm driving down the road and then I notice that there are tons of bad conditions that are related to like maybe road safety, and then someone else is watching me saying that's just a shit driver.
Yes. I like that example. I might use that from now on.
Okay.
This is not a question, but Rebecca's lectures have been great.
Hey,
they are great lectures, and Rebecca is just a great teacher overall. So you guys are lucky to have her.
Thank you very much. It's been such a bizarre semester because obviously, as a lecturer, I'm not able to hear how these lectures are landing in the moment. So that's really thank you for the compliments. I appreciate that.
Under difficult circumstances, it feels like we're all inside a big social psychology experiment.
Wow.
Being run by Milgrams in Bardo. Everyone's mixed in, playing games with us the last few months.
I can't argue with that.
Not an ethical study either.
No, I'd like to see the HREC approval for that study.
When making attributions about others, what do you mean by internal dispositional factors?
You can view those things as synonymous. Internal means dispositional, means something about the person's personality, as opposed to external attributions, which are about the situation, the circumstance, the environment. So something outside the person versus inside or within the person.
Yep.
Are the experiments significant? Will we need to mention any experiments to back up a concept? I bet you it's the same person, Caleb, every time asking this question. The experiments that you reference throughout your lecture series, do they need to mention them explicitly in answering the questions for the exam?
Only insofar as they help to provide evidence for whatever it is that the question is. I mean, I think everyone has probably answered questions like this. All of the webinar participants have probably been asked a question about this. I never expect people to memorize names and dates and exact figures. I always want, if someone is going to cite that, I want it to be in service of linking that experiment to a theory or linking that experiment to some kind of example. And because it's a take-home exam, it's easy to look up those particular details. So I don't expect them. And I would only expect to see something about that, a specific experiment, insofar as it relates to, it furthers the argument about whatever the question is without giving anything away about the question.
Yeah, Shaun always gets frustrated by these. No, I don't think it's the same person. What I think it is it's a question, again, which is written in code, which basically means, do I have to read about the experiments? Okay, exams coming up. I've got 3 other exams to study for. What do I need to study? Well, you kind of have your exam answer there from Rebecca, which is you need to know enough to be able to link them. You need to know why they're being referenced. You don't need to remember all the details, but because you can look them up anyway in an open book exam, but these things are not things you can ignore completely because they provide the evidence for the theories and they allow you to critically examine the theories themselves. So yes, it has come up in every single webinar. You know, how much detail do we need to remember about the examples, or do we need to know dates for the history ones? No, but it helps to read around and not limit what you're studying.
Just to clarify, would you make an internal attribution for someone who has high consistency but low consensus and distinctive information? If so, could you explain why? Thank you. That's a lot of words.
Okay,
high consistency,
I
low
know
consensus.
what the person is referring to, and I'll just find it on my screen. Again, it's going to be much more straightforward to go through it this way. They're referring to the Kelly covariation model.
Okay.
So
high consistency, low consensus, and distinctive.
I think high consistency, low consensus makes sense, but then the distinctive information part throws me a little bit. So it'll be good to hear you explain, Rebecca.
Sure. Okay, so would you make an internal attribution? Sorry, can you put the question back up?
It is a complicated one.
It's coming from Kelly's covariation model, which is about attribution. So this is lecture 2. Someone who has high consistency, low consensus, and I don't know whether they're asking low distinctive or high distinctive. If it's, so to use Kelly's covariation model, the answer to the consistency question is that it always has to be high. So we can't really even use the rest of the model unless the answer to that question was yes or high, depending on how you're phrasing the question. High consistency, low consensus, low distinctiveness is an internal attribution, but high consistency, low consensus, and high distinctiveness leads to an interaction. It's a combination of external and internal attributions that a person would make. So if I'm interpreting the question as high consistency, low consensus, and low distinctiveness, that does lead to an internal attribution. And let's go through an example of why. Consistency is about, does the actor behave the same toward the stimulus in a different situation? And the answer in this case is yes. Consensus is, do other people behave the same toward the stimulus? If the answer is no, in this case, then that's telling us, that combination is, it's telling us something about the person. And finally, distinctiveness, does the actor behave the same toward different stimuli? In this case, we're saying no, it's not, it's low in distinctiveness. And that combination of high consistency, low consensus, and low distinctiveness is part of an internal attribution.
So could I ask, what's the difference between consistency and distinctive information?
Consistency is about the person behaving the same toward the same stimulus in a different situation. Distinctiveness is about the person, the actor, behaving towards different stimuli. So in the example that I gave in class, it was about dating. Katy Perry and Orlando Bloom. And it was about why would they want to get together. So consistency in this case would be Katy is often interested in Orlando. She's consistently asking Orlando Bloom out. This is, you have to suspend your disbelief that they have not yet become a couple. So she's consistently, every day this week, she's asked him out. Distinctiveness is, does she ask out other individuals?
Other celebrities.
Other celebrities.
Because celebrities can only date celebrities,
exactly.
Apparently.
And if you had that combination of high consistency, she's asked him out every day this week. Low consensus, she doesn't, other people don't find Orlando Bloom as a wonderful prospective partner. And high distinctiveness, that she only has eyes for Orlando Bloom. We end up with this interaction between an internal and external attribution, as
So
opposed to the other combinations.
Is this the case for what kind of attributions you should be making, or is it just a description of the factors that lead to an internal external attribution?
That is a really great question. My understanding of the covariation model is it's descriptive. It's how do we end up coming up with an internal or external attribution. It doesn't account for the fundamental attribution error, which is kind of, us being able to look beyond just the heuristic cause and think about or spend the mental energy to try to understand a person's situation. The covariation model isn't doing that at all. It's just describing how it is that people end up making an internal versus external attribution. It's not really giving us the tools to critically understand a person.
I understand. Cool.
Okay. A complicated one. They can't all be like that, sure.
I wouldn't mind. That's a good question. Could you please explain incongruent cognitions again?
The simple answer to that, so yes, I can. The simple answer to that is it's just when the facts do not align in your head. So you've got an attitude towards, let's say you're trying to improve your dental hygiene, and you know that it's good for you to brush your teeth twice a day and to floss and to use some kind of rinse. And you think that these are all good things because not only will it give you a cleaner mouth, fresh breath, and good oral health, but it's also something that other people like. All of those things would be congruent, right? They all lead towards, yeah, this is a good thing to do, to engage in these activities. But if you feel like, I know these are good for me, these are good behaviors to do, but I'm just too tired to do anything about it. And actually, come to think of it, I think there might be something in that fluoride toothpaste, and that's probably not so good. You get these inconsistencies in your internal thoughts about the particular behavior. And these inconsistencies in the thoughts, or possibly the actions, in that I might think that all of these things are really good for me, and yet I don't brush my teeth twice a day, or I never floss my teeth. That's where you get the incongruent set of thoughts, behaviors, or actions. And that, according to Festinger, leads to dissonance, when you have the mismatch between your thoughts and your behaviors and your actions. And it's uncomfortable.
I should be studying now. They're all thinking.
Would you say altruistically motivated people might be subconsciously feel better about themselves from helping others, even though they have empathic concern? Does that make them egoistic? Motivate.
So that is the part of the core of the argument between researchers from the altruistic camp and researchers from the egoistic camp. And so people like Robert Cialdini, who is part of the egoistic motivation camp, will say, yeah, all helping. There's no such thing as altruistic helping. Everything we do is ultimately motivated by how it makes us feel. And so that line of reasoning would say, yeah, you may not consciously say that you're doing this behavior to feel good about yourself, but it's there, it's under the surface. So yes, some people would say that there is no such thing as helping out of the goodness of your heart, that you're always doing something, it's always benefiting you in some way. I'm reading a grant about that right now, but I'm not at liberty to say much more about it.
It's a very cynical view of the world, that you're only altruistic because there's something in it for you, which is, it's like,
which makes you wonder how it leads to some fascinating questions about the evolution of cooperative behaviors and that kind of thing.
Sounds as if it's a statement as opposed to something that you can test, because it seems like you would be able to account for any seemingly altruistic behavior, no matter what it presents as.
Yeah. So
how would you disprove it?
There's these researchers have been chasing each other's research programs for decades now, trying to poke holes in one another's ideas and try to come up with stringent tests of it. But I have to admit, I haven't kept up with the research, so I'm not sure where they're up to with being able to tease apart the motives.
I don't quite understand your diagram for the 3 parts of prejudice in your lecture slide. Why is prejudice itself one of the 3 parts that make up prejudice, or am I misunderstanding?
It can be confusing, and it's probably something that I can express better when I'm in front of people in the lecture theater. Think about prejudice on that slide as the umbrella term. And I should note, and this is something that I think Caleb and I have discussed, and Caleb and Fiona and I have discussed, I'm presenting this tripartite view of attitudes and a tripartite view of prejudice, and I'm linking those two views together. Not everybody views, there's not really consensus on whether that's the only way to conceptualize prejudice, but the way I've been talking about it is on that slide, that prejudice is the overarching concept, and there are three parts to it. There's a part that aligns with our cognitions, that's the stereotypes. There's a part that aligns with our attitudes, or our feelings, I should say, our feelings, our evaluations, and that's the part that is lowercase p, prejudice. And then there are our behaviors, and that aligns with discrimination. So stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination align with the cognitive, affective, and behavioral components of attitudes.
I'm just trying to find it in our
It's a bit of Inception. It does make sense though.
It's essentially, and the other problem is we often use those words interchangeably. And we'll talk about someone's stereotypes when we technically mean their evaluations, which is actually their prejudice. Or we're talking, behavior is the most straightforward one. Discrimination always aligns with behavior. Yes, that's it. The pre-work there.
Yeah, which I think I asked you to check 2 years ago, and small changes were made to kind of conform to what you were telling everyone in lectures. So
yes, thanks.
Excellent. Okay, let's.
In covariation model, you said if distinctive information is yes and consensus is no, then there would be interaction between person and situation. Is this also true if distinctive is no and consensus is yes?
No. If distinctive is no and consensus is yes, that's when you have an internal attribution. So if you go back to, this is coming back from lecture 2, there's a slide that has the title that says Covariation Model, and the table is, it goes through all of the combinations we've just discussed. Consistency is high for all of them, and then all that changes is whether consensus and distinctiveness are high or low. And when all three are high, that's an external attribution. When consistency is high, but distinctiveness and consensus are low, that's when you have an internal attribution. And when consistency is high, consensus is low, and distinctiveness is high, there's an interaction. You can't use the model if consistency is low.
Oh my, okay, oh my. It gets rather complicated, doesn't it?
It does, but again, I think yeah, that's the table. Thank you.
Okay.
I think that if you understand just independently consistency, consensus, and distinctive, like Rebecca was saying, and then apply it to situations, you could probably understand it. It does make sense.
Well, probably the best way, just going through, like Shaun gave an example a few minutes ago about being stuck in traffic, or being a driver and noticing other people's bad behaviors, and then also thinking about the situation that they're in. That's a really good way to work through, pick a behavior and then try to work through the covariation model and work through those three columns in order to generate your own examples of how to make an internal or external attribution for the same behavior.
I hope we don't have 9 more unique combinations on that.
We might skip it. Do we need to know details on the Stanford prison experiment if it was only used as an example of obedience in lecture 5? Stanford prison experiment seems pretty important to be.
Oh, Franz would have mentioned it too, surely. It came up in our history tutorial.
And that's probably where it's best situated, frankly, to be in a history tutorial. I discuss it as part of the obedience lecture, that's right. It could also be discussed as part of attributions, where we're making internal or external attributions for these guards' behavior. I pretty much talk about it as a field experiment or I don't remember actually if I gave it, I don't think I used the terminology quasi-experiment. I probably talked about it as a field experiment of obedience. I speak about it for the historical relevance that it has. It's relevant to things that happen right now if you turn on the news. No, you don't need to know the details of it, is the short answer to that question. I don't go into a lot of detail about it because it's probably better viewed as fiction. It's not entirely fictitious, but from the reports that have come out since the Stanford prison experiment became this pop cultural idea. I almost said zeitgeist. I know that's a recurrent theme in the webinars. Look, it's not as clear cut as Zimbardo would like us to believe, and in fact, there may be some elaborations that he and his team are responsible for, which is why it's not at the top of my list anymore of examples to go through, because there's some question about whether what happened was more
manufactured.
Yeah, right.
It's been in our history tute now for maybe 4 years, and it keeps changing even in the history tute. Most recently when the full recordings were released last year or the year before, and Zimbardo was caught giving the nasty guard some ideas, which kind of puts a different spin on it.
Yeah, and certainly it makes a better topic for movies, and there have been at least 2, if not 3, fictionalized versions in different languages.
Yeah, I've seen a German one, Das Experiment.
Yes, I watched that when I was a PhD student. That was one of our brown bag seminars, as we got to watch that film together, debate the merits of it.
It's such a good point, because Michael was here last week, and it's just once you, I'm not sure if it was Zimbardo's intention for it to become this pop cultural thing, but then once you release your science, especially in psychology, out to the public, it's no longer yours, is it? It's the society's. Yeah.
And it's important that that as consumers of research, that we look at these with a critical lens, and not just routinely or rotely follow that, oh, okay, they said that this happened, that's what I think happened. You need to evaluate the science.
I think something interesting is on Twitter, I'm following a bunch of epidemiologists now, and it's funny to see them dissecting each other's work. And so a paper gets pushed out as a preprint, and then the news takes the title and then makes an article about it. And then you have these epidemiologists in real time reviewing and then tearing it to shreds. And I think like that would be good for psychology in general, but also social psychology, just to pick at what the news are actually claiming from fairly relevant articles. So
I agree.
Don't get your research information from newspapers.
No.
I heard Alex Blazinski, our gambling professor, on ABC radio yesterday, and the newsreader said, here's what the professor has said, and then they played a short audio clip which did not map the description of what he apparently said. That wasn't a complete opposite. Maybe they took it from a different part of the interview, but it just seemed very bizarre.
Well, peer review is there for a reason in science. Could you please go over the elaboration likelihood model? Thank you. What's the elaboration likelihood model?
It wasn't a whole lecture, was it, Rebecca?
It wasn't a whole lecture. It's in, I think, let's see, maybe lecture 3? Yes, lecture 3. There is a slide. I can share the screen if you'd like.
Oh, I might be able to find it quicker.
Okay. I think you just...
Oh, yeah, because we've been... Hang on. Haven't we done this today already?
That was... there's a lot from this lecture that's coming up. It's after those slides.
Oh, no, sorry, elaboration.
I use the same colors, and that's why it might be... it might look so familiar.
Is it before here or after here?
After that.
Changing attitudes.
There it is.
There you go.
My God. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. So I use the same colors for the boxes for no good reason other than they were already easy to use. Okay. So the elaboration likelihood model is a model of persuasion, where you're trying to convince someone to buy your product, vote for your political candidate, whatever the case may be. So the green box here is what the message is that you are going to deliver to your intended audience. In order to best tailor your message, you need to know something about your audience. And you can see from the diagram here, the main way that these two paths diverge has to do with central features of your audience. I shouldn't say central, with this question in the middle here about your audience. Are they motivated and able to process the information? If yes, then you go down the central route. If no, then you go down the peripheral route. So motivated has to do with, is this issue or product or whatever it is that you're trying to communicate about, is it something that's really important and significant, holds personal relevance to people? That's what's kind of one of the things behind motivated. Able to process is your audience, are they attentive? Do they have cognitive resources? Are they drunk? Are they sleepy? Are they sleep deprived? Are they children? Okay, those types of factors all come into play with determining whether your audience is motivated and able to process. If they are motivated and able to process, then you're better off to try to persuade them with a message that involves compelling arguments. A message that they're going to think about critically, a message that they're going, as Shaun was just saying, that these epidemiologists, they tear through the science and they really, they're looking at the trustworthiness of the statements. So that's what's happening with people who are being persuaded via the central route. The arguments that you put into your communication have to be compelling, strong arguments. If that's the case, if you have successfully used these kinds of arguments, then you're going to get long-lasting change. Your message will land to a recipient, to an audience member who is then likely to buy the product, vote for the candidate, whatever. On the other hand, if your topic is kind of superficial, or whatever it is you're trying to communicate about is superficial, it's not particularly important to people, or they're not able to process the message, then you can go down this peripheral route to persuade them, where instead of relying on strong arguments that are really well thought out, you're providing people with different cues. It may be in the form of a celebrity endorsement. It may just be in the form of the number of arguments that you provide rather than how compelling those arguments are. These types of peripheral cues are used and people go, yep, okay, fine, I'll buy the product. I'll vote for the candidate. I'll do whatever the case may be. So, you can think about, this is a really good way of thinking about the elaboration likelihood model. Come up with become your own salesperson. Come up with a pitch for a product. Come up with a pitch for a political idea. How would you, what kinds of factors would you need to take into consideration to sell this argument, this product, this person, this idea to various audiences?
It's my own personal bias, but looking at this theory, I see my role as a unit of study coordinator. And tell me if I'm getting this right. So I've got to sell the idea of them signing up to SONA, right? To complete their 5 hours. And I may have put up an announcement this week that went along, that basically used the peripheral route. The central route would be, look, you're studying psychology, you need to understand how research works, you need to be in a strong position to be able to critique research, sign up for studies, understand every aspect of the process and become a powerful thinker. But I usually go the peripheral route, which is, it's worth 5%, and 5% is 20 marks out of 100 in your research report. So why are you disappointed you got 40 for your research report when you haven't done your research?
You have successfully gone through the peripheral route, and then hopefully you've managed to get short-term change, but that's all they need, right? Get the 5%, pass the course.
I know, but as a coordinator, if you're always prodding people with a peripheral route, is there a danger that you're disengaging genuinely motivated people, or they look at messages like that and just think, oh, well, that's for people who don't understand the true significance of research?
Right, the ones who are motivated and able to process are going, okay, I can see what Caleb is doing there. He's trying to convince all of my peers who are not necessarily so keenly interested in the process, and that's going to work for them. But I'm sticking with this research participation because ultimately I want to become a researcher, and I need to get dip my toes in the water of being a participant in the first place.
I'm assuming most people who are watching a webinar in the middle of Studebaker. Not interested in the peripheral route.
In lecture 3, ALM, what happens if your answer was not to compelling arguments and peripheral cues? What happens if your answer was no to compelling arguments and peripheral cues?
So that's going back to the same slide that Caleb was just on.
Because you haven't described it there, I see, because compelling is yes and no, and then peripheral is only yes. Same thing with compelling arguments. Is there another subset where it's no to central route, no to peripheral route, and then branches off once more?
No to compelling.
Yeah, I see what they're saying. So what was the question?
So if it's no to motivation, so peripheral route, and then instead of being yes, it's no to peripheral route, is there anything that you can do then?
It's essentially that fork in the road is the path that they're on. So you wouldn't want to mix and match and provide a peripheral cue and a compelling argument. You're kind of set in your ways. You're going to either go down the path on the left or the path on the right. And so if I've understood the question.
Can you put the question up, Caleb, because you're blocking it? Are you still there, Dr. Owens?
Oh, can you not see it?
There you go. Now we can.
If you answer no to compelling arguments, so you wouldn't even, to even be on the pathway where you want to provide compelling arguments means you know your audience is motivated. So you would never mix the two. You only provide compelling arguments if you have a motivated audience who's ready to receive your message. You don't give peripheral cues to that audience, which is, I think, maybe what Caleb was just talking about, where, you know, it's not going to be effective when people who are, peripheral cues are going to be less effective for an audience that's ready and motivated to understand or to think about these issues. Peripheral cues are going to not be useful to them.
So it's a dichotomy then.
Exactly. So it's a
Black or
dual,
white.
it's technically a dual process model. This one is called the elaboration likelihood model. There's also the heuristic, the same type of model, which is about they call it heuristic processing model. It's the same thing. You either go to the path on one path or the other, and you don't cross your cues.
Yep. Okay. I'm sure the motivated people have finished their 5 hours weeks ago.
I don't fully understand what adding new consonant cognitions as a way of reducing cognitive dissonance means.
It's the easiest way to make things right in the world again, in the world inside your head. When you have a dissonance, when you experience incongruent cognitions or dissonance, the easiest thing to do is to bring something new into the mix that realigns things. And in the case of the reason why I was talking about the cognitive dissonance studies was that Festinger realized that adding a new consonant cognition, in this case, changing your attitude to align with your actions, that's the quickest and easiest way to make things right again. That's considered adding a consonant cognition to make things right again. So if we think about the classic experiment here, where people lied for the paltry sum of $1, rather than, they can't go back and change their behavior. They've already told the other person a lie. They've already accepted the dollar. I suppose they could have returned the dollar. I don't know that anyone did that. They just say, hey, you know, I didn't lie after all. I think it really was an interesting task and it was full of all sorts of scientific merit. That's the easiest thing for them to do. They've added a consonant cognition. My attitude aligns with my behavior. I didn't lie. I was telling the truth. This is an interesting experiment. This is an interesting task. All is right in the world again. Instead of how they felt possibly in the moments prior, which is, I just sold my soul for $1. I see myself as a good person and I've just lied. This was a really boring task, but I told somebody it was an interesting task. That's where you get the dissonance and the tension.
So is it a lie you tell to yourself then?
It's a lie you tell to yourself. And then, of course, if your experimenter asks you, how did you really feel about it? You tell them, well, yes, it really was an interesting, you self-deceive, yes.
Self-deception. That's been my example for hypotheses in the stats lectures. So first year students get this twice, basically.
Yes.
They get my croaky explanation of cognitive dissonance, and then yours.
But you're focusing on the numbers, right, and how they actually don't.
Oh no, not even that. Just the idea of hypothesizing something that's counterintuitive.
Okay. Well, because in one of the things I mentioned in conjunction with describing cognitive dissonance and showing that slide, which is an extract from the original paper, is people have gone back and looked at those data and went, oh, you know what? It's impossible to get these values with 20 participants per cell or whatever it was.
Oh.
So it's another example of, you know, however, in the case, so what I do in introducing these classic studies to the PSYC1001 students is I note that there has been this replication crisis, and I note that studies that have either not replicated or have become questioned or are being questioned, I put a little asterisk next to them. So it doesn't mean it's a really important study. It means maybe there's going to be a footnote about this study down the track about whether we can actually, how reliable and robust it is. In the case of cognitive dissonance, if we set aside that original study, there's been lots of literature to show that this is a reliable effect. It's just that in that original study, there's something unusual going on with the numbers.
Yeah.
Are prejudices / stereotypes, etc., more prevalent in individualist or collectivist cultures, or do they just vary in their manifestations? Is this a lecture question, or is this?
I introduced the idea of cultural differences, and I said that it's not assessable. I just wanted to set people up with, I wanted to make that clear that much of what we talk about at least what I talk about in these lectures, is based on populations or samples derived from Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic nations. So WEIRD is the acronym there. So to contrast that, there's of course researchers in collectivist cultures who have said, hang on a second, your Western psychology doesn't actually align with the phenomena that we're seeing in Eastern or collectivist cultures. So that question is a speculation question. It's not something I mentioned in lecture. It's really interesting to think about. I would advise the person asking the question, if it's something you're interested in, by all means pursue that as an honors topic.
Yep. It's Psych-EFI first, because it might have been done, but good honors topic.
If distinctive is no and consensus is yes, you just said this is internal, but that isn't in table.
Oh, back to
Oh, he's saying that they're saying that in your table, you don't have that set of options.
I don't have the words yes and no. I have high for yes and low for no. So internal is high consistency, low consensus, low distinctiveness. Or if you want to think about it as yeses and nos, consistency yes, consensus no, distinctiveness no. That combination gives you an internal or a person level attribution.
So what is there?
Okay, that's enough of those ones.
Yeah.
We kind of need.
Let's not answer this question. What experiment would you do if ethics and costs were not an issue? Would Rebecca understand the inside joke of me asking a question about the research report?
She wouldn't.
I have no idea what the research report was.
Oh, it's just we had so many webinars on the research report.
And it was due 6 weeks ago, and this student asks every time, when is it due?
Oh.
I predict it's Graham Stoney, FYI. Any books, podcasts, Netflix recommendations relating to social psych? Rebecca.
Oh, goodness. Quick book recommendations would be take a look at Malcolm Gladwell's books. He was a keynote speaker at the Society for Personality and Social Psychology conference ages ago, and he was looking at the researchers in the room like they were rock stars, and they were looking at him like he was a rock star. He has a knack for taking social science research and distilling it into these he weaves it into these narratives, and it's really, really great. So many of you will be familiar with Outliers and Blink and The Tipping Point. That would be
Malcolm Gladwell.
Yes.
He also has a podcast, right? Is it?
Yes. Revisionist History. He also has a music-related podcast, but I don't think that's what the person was asking about. Revisionist History. I put a link to, he talked about the Milgram studies in the last season, one of the episodes from last season about actually, it was an excerpt from his most recent book called Talking to Strangers. But he also had a clip, he used it as one of the podcast episodes. He's really great at taking research and making it accessible to a general audience. That would be place number one. I've put some links up to some of the pop culture work from Milgram and Zimbardo. Yeah, there's probably too many to list in the next few minutes. So if anyone's particularly interested, I might compile a list and you can email me about that. But certainly Gladwell is a good place to start.
I say with podcasts as well, there's the Intelligence Squared Debates podcast, which I like. They're not always relevant to social psych, but they do have social psych ones there. I don't think I could apply the concept of cognitive dissonance. Like, I get it, but I don't understand it. I think Rebecca's example was great with the toothpaste, because it's like, you know that you should be brushing your teeth twice a day. You might not be. And so then your cognitive dissonance would let you to believe that like there's fluoride in toothpaste. So that's okay if I don't brush it twice a day.
Well, the reason why it's in the lecture series that it is it's essentially you're persuading yourself is what the point of the way I've put cognitive dissonance into the lecture series is as a way of changing your own attitude. So you may act in a particular way that's inconsistent with your beliefs, then you change your attitude to match the behavior. And so it's persuasion, it's attitude change, but it's attitude change that's brought about by the self. And that's in contrast to, for example, the elaboration likelihood model, which we spent a lot of time talking about this afternoon, which is when someone else is trying to change your attitude. So there are different pathways. If you want to take a step back and think about it, there are different pathways involved in changing attitudes. One is brought about by the self, one is brought about by others.
And cognitive dissonance is all about finding yourself almost as the recipient of behavior, observing a behavior that's already happened or can't be stopped, and then convincing yourself, persuading yourself, making excuses for yourself why this is something that has to be done that you may have done intentionally, even when you clearly hadn't. I remember years ago, speaking of protests, or not speaking of protests, Shaun was worried we'd get hammered with questions about the current disaster in the United States at the moment, but nothing came up. But I remember years ago being involved in a protest against the invasion of Iraq, the second Iraq war. And thousands of us marched around Sydney, and the public was very much against Australia going to war at that time. But then a few weeks later, they took a very similar poll and found that most Australians were suddenly happy that we were doing it. Because at that point, the troops had been sent, we were doing it. And it was like people were trying to deal with this cognitive dissonance. Well, we can't continue to be against it now. Not everyone, but they're obviously enough to tip the poll that suddenly, okay, we're doing it now, so we might as well support our troops. That's kind of a collective self-persuasion that what is kind of out of our control, well, let's pretend that we intended it to be that way.
That's a really salient example, and I'm sure students can extrapolate from that to what's happened with social distancing measures, what's happening elsewhere.
Yeah, but I mean, look, a lot of these questions, do we need to know the examples and things like that? For all our lecture topics, the best examples that you need to learn and understand are the ones you create yourselves. I think it's the ultimate study technique. So come up with examples of cognitive dissonance, come up with examples of central and peripheral persuasion, share them with each other, hit the study groups, test each other, trick each other. You want the no, yes ones we've had all the way through. Do those on each other. As long as those internet forums get shut down during the exam itself. I think that's the best way to study. I always say, Shaun, we're out of time, and Shaun.
That's rapid fire.
Shaun wants
There's only 6
one
left.
more question. Yeah, but they're not 6 questions.
I'm sure they're not going to be relevant. Are there any social psychology fun facts?
Yes,
They're all
there are.
fun. There are, yes. Next. Is there any type of social psych in 1 002? No. Next. Are you familiar with Erich von Markowicz's, aka mystery work on sexual attraction?
That's a question that's best addressed in Dr. Darnimrod's 3rd year unit of study.
Ah, there you go.
Oh, so Dr. Dar Nimrod is our third year social psych lecturer. So, and he does research on sex. You may have signed up for one of his SONA studies.
It's not me, but I wish it was. Graham, can you explain the quiz show program, please? Nope.
Paradigm.
Next. Oh, quiz show Paradigm. Bruce loves that one, doesn't he? Can you tell us some social psychology facts? What's Rebecca's cat's name?
That's
the last
Lucy,
one.
and she's been hanging out, waiting for her moment to shine on camera because she's been interrupting all of the lectures, but she's opted to sit in the window.
Okay, are you happy, Shaun? The last few questions.
More than happy, elated.
Through all the good stuff. The timing is almost perfect. So thanks so much, Rebecca, for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Thanks for I think we nearly touched 30. We're down to 19 now, but thanks for everyone who participated, who sent in the good questions. And can everyone have a safe weekend, please? And study well. Try not to be distracted by the terrible events of the world right now.
Yep. I think this means that we have to have a Friday webinar as well, Caleb. There were
I guess so.
People.
So Friday's webinar was just going to be about general exam questions and things like that. So we'll send out an email. And look, if we don't get an audience, Shaun and I will just talk about Star Wars as per usual.
Hey, great.
A lot of the rings. See you, Rebecca.
Everyone.
Bye, Caleb. Bye, everyone.